Hi, everybody. My name is Amanda.
I'm Safwan.
Hi, I'm Muriel.
I'm Grace.
And today we are presenting on the Module 8 covering Week 8's content, covering Mesoamerican civilization.
I will be presenting this week's reading, The Mexico That Spain Encountered by Susan Schroeder. The Mexica, also known as the Aztecs, rose from humble beginnings to establish one of the most formidable empires in Mesoamerican history. Descendants of the Chichimeca, a group of nomadic people from the north, the Mexica embarked on a journey southward in search of a new homeland. Their migration was fraught with the challenges as they encountered established cultures that viewed them with skepticism and hostility. Rejected by the dominant civilizations of the time, such as the Toltecs and the Tepanecs, the Mexica faced constant struggles for survival and recognition. Determined to carve out their place in the central region of Mesoamerica, the Mexica turned to alliances with neighboring city-states, engaging in both diplomacy and warfare to secure their foothold in the region. However, it was not merely through military might that the Mexica sought to assert their legitimacy. Recognizing the importance of cultural assimilation, they adopted elements of the civilization they encountered, incorporating traditions, religious practices, and architectural styles into their own culture. Through perseverance, resilience, and a relentless pursuit of their goals, the Mexica gradually rose to prominence, laying the foundation for what would eventually become the mighty Aztec Empire. At the heart of the Aztec society lays a complex web of social and political hierarchies. The empire was divided into city-states known as Altepetl, each governed by its own ruler and surrounded by smaller units called Calpulli. The hierarchy within these city-states was well defined, with the highest position occupied by the high priest and the council/priesthood, followed by the nobles, merchants, and artisans. At the base of the social pyramid were the commoners, including farmers and slaves. Rigid social roles dictated their responsibilities and privileges, yet mobility was possible through acts of valor in warfare, successful trade endeavors, or strategic marriages. Next slide, please. Religion permeated every facet of Aztec life, shaping their worldview and guiding their actions. The Aztecs worshipped a diverse pantheon of gods and goddesses, each associated with various aspects of nature, fertility, and warfare. Rituals and ceremonies played a crucial role in appeasing these deities and maintaining cosmic balance. Human sacrifice, though controversial to modern sensibilities, was viewed as a sacred duty to ensure the continuation of life and the prosperity of the empire. Despite their reputation as formidable warriors, Aztecs were also adept traders and merchants. They developed extensive trade networks that spanned Mesoamerica, facilitating exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. The bustling markets of the cities like Tlatelolco served as hubs of commerce, where merchants from far and wide converged to barter and trade a diverse array of goods, from agricultural produce to luxury items like feathers, gold, and precious stones. Aztec art and art culture flourished, producing some of the most breathtaking works of Mesoamerican civilization. Skilled artisans crafted intricate featherwork, dazzling ceramics, and imposing stone sculptures that adored temples and palaces. Architecture reached new heights of sophistication, with monumental pyramids and temples serving as testaments to the empire's grandeur. Literature, music, and dance thrived as expressions of Aztec identity and heritage, with poems and songs recounting the empire's heroic deeds and mythic origins. Next slide, please. Under visionary leaders like Itzcoatl and Tlaquelel, the Aztecs embarked on a relentless campaign of expansion and imperialism. Through alliances, conquests, and strategic diplomacy, they forged the Triple Alliance with neighboring city-states, bringing vast territories under their control. The empire reached its zenith under rulers like Moctezuma II, whose reign saw the construction of magnificent temples, palaces, and infrastructure projects that showcased the empire's power and wealth. However, the Aztec Empire's fate took a tragic turn with the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors in the early 16th century. Led by Hernan Cortes, These European invaders possessed superior technology, weaponry, and disease immunity that decimated the indigenous population. Despite their valiant resistance, the Aztecs were unfortunately overwhelmed by the Spanish onslaught, culminating in the fall of their capital city, Tenochtitlan, in 1521. The conquest of the Aztec Empire marked the beginning of a new chapter in history, one characterized by colonization, exploitation, and cultural upheaval. Thank you.
So, the Codex Bourbonicus was one of the largest surviving ancient Mexican manuscripts, and it's painted on one side of paper made from the bark of a fig tree. It describes various deities and rituals in four main sections. The first section describing a ritual calendar of 260 days, including deities presiding over different days. And the second part shows representations of Lords of the Night, which is associated with numbers and year bearers of the 52-year cycles, with large mythical figures. The third part portrays rural scenes associated with 18 annual ceremonies of the solar year, depicting various scenes of deity impersonators, priests, musicians, and commoners engaged in agriculture and social rituals. The fourth part includes representations of deities dominating the 52-year cycle and focuses on the new fire ceremony. And these two pictures are from the Codex Bourbonicus, and the purpose of the document is still debated by scholars, but its illustrations and content provide insights into the Mesoamerican culture and religious practices. Next slide, please. So, the legend of the fifth sun in the Aztec creation myth. The legend of the fifth sun describes how the world originated after four previous cycles of creation and destruction. So, two gods gave birth to four suns, who created the universe by forming two suns, each marked by the sacrifice of a god and ended catastrophically, leading to the emergence of a new sun. So the first sun was Tezcatlipoca, was the first god to sacrifice himself by leaping into the new fire and starting the first sun called Four Tiger. This time was inhabited by giants who only ate acorns, and it ended when the giants were eaten by jaguars. And the second sun was ruled by Quetzalcoatl and named Fourwind. It saw catastrophic hurricanes and floods, which turned humans into monkeys. And they flee to the tops of trees when the floods came, and that led to the end of the world. And the third son was named Four-Rain and ruled by Tlaloc. People ate seeds grown in water, and it ended when another god made it rain fire and ashes. And the survivors became turkeys, butterflies, or dogs. And this was a shorter sun lasting 364 years, while the other suns lasted around 670 years. And then the fourth sun was called Four Water, and it was governed by a goddess where the people ate maize, and a great flood came. The fourth world ended when people turned into fish. Next slide, please. So this led to the creation of the fifth sun, and that began with the sacrifice of the humble god Nanahuatzin, and he became the new sun. But the rich and proud god Tezetkal jumped in the fire after him, and so he was also sacrificed. But he became the moon after the gods threw in a rabbit because they decided two suns would overwhelm the world. The fifth sun is associated with earthquakes and movement, and it's called Four Movement. And this led to the new fire ceremony, which the Aztecs believe in nourishing the sun god and maintaining their world through blood offerings and sacrifices, and conducting the new fire ceremony every 52 years to ensure the continuation of the sun's movement. Thank you.
So now we are going into talk about the video titled Olmec Heads. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Olmec civilization. So the Olmec were the first civilization in the Americas, and this was about 3,000 years ago. This means that this civilization predated even the Mayan and the Aztec empires. Its major cities lie all along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, as you can see in the photo to the right. Now, this civilization actually didn't have its own written language, nor did it have any form of documentation about its cultural practices. And so it is called what we know as an archaeological culture, which is essentially when archaeologists assemble bits and pieces of what they have discovered from the earth to put together a picture of what they think that civilization looked like 3,000 years ago. But what they have found is that the civilization was a complex and hierarchical society with many elaborate monuments, and their diet came from activities such as hunting, fishing, and eventually farming, with their main farming food being corn. Now, it was named Olmec actually by the archaeologists themselves, stemming from an Aztec word meaning the inhabitant of the rubber country. And the reason that they called it that is because along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, there are actually abundant rubber supplies that they believe that the Olmec civilization used for production purposes. But not just for production, they also believe that they used it for leisure activities. One of the archaeological discoveries discussed in the film was a ball that was made out of rubber, thought and believed to be used for a classic Mesoamerican ball game, which would have made the Olmec civilization the founders of that game. Moving on into the religious practices of the Olmec civilization. The Olmec has strong links to the supernatural world, and they had oftentimes gruesome ceremonies used to communicate with the supernatural. They were a polytheistic civilization, believing in many gods, who often took on human form, but with animal-like qualities, including reptiles, cats, and even birds. They believed that their deities were responsible for controlling the world that they saw around them, and that they required appeasement, oftentimes through sacrifices. Some of the archaeological discoveries surrounding their religious practices that were discussed in the film, they found ceremonial wooden heads, which wood is very uncommon to find within archaeology because oxygen actually degrades the wood and causes it to decompose. However, these were special because they were encased in thick, deep mud, which prevented them from having access to oxygen, and therefore they were maintained even after 3,000 years. Now, these ceremonial heads also were found with something a little bit more gruesome. They also found it with a pile of small bones, which eventually they discovered came from an unborn fetus. After further digging, they discovered, along with these heads, were more piles of bones. Many of them were from unborn fetuses, as well as newborn fetuses, many of which were dismembered in the sacrificial process. As unfortunate as this practice seems and as gruesome as it is, it's an archaeologically significant discovery because it is the first evidence of human sacrifice in the Americas. Now, moving on to something that the Olmec civilization is, one might say, best known for, which is the construction of these gigantic stone heads. As you can see from the photos on the right, these heads were constructed to look like older, mature men, thought and likely to be portraits of their ancient rulers. Now, the Olmec, they did not have wheels, they didn't have metal or fancy tools to construct these heads. And they traveled miles and miles to collect these rocks from the base of volcanic mountains, which were anywhere from 30 to 100 miles from their home civilization. There is currently no archaeological evidence for how they accomplished either the carving or the transportation of these massive rocks. So far, 17 heads in total have been found. So the film goes into the discussion of how did the Olmec both transport these massive rocks as well as carve them without access to modern day tools. And so they had a team of archaeologists set out to test how the Olmec might have done it. So English engineer Peter Guthrie and Bob Lowe set out to move a 12-ton stone in only 10 days across land and water back to one of the major cities of the Olmec. They utilized only sticks and ropes and levers to create a railway system in order to transport this rock. But it was a lot more difficult than they expected, and it took them 5 whole days just to move the rock onto a platform. Now, this platform, they were intending for it to be a place where the rock would sit and slide across a series of rolling sticks that were greased up in order to make the transport process easier. However, nothing went according to plan, and it took a lot more effort than they thought it was going to take. In the end, they were able to transport the rock across land and get it to the river where they hoped to put the rock onto a raft and transport down to the town. So they made a raft out of bamboo, and they also used the native found rubber to coat the bases of several canoes in order to make the raft more buoyant. So in the end, they were able to get the rock onto the raft. However, they ran out of time and weren't able to get the rock to float down to the city as they had hoped. Now, there was another team led by Glenn Williams, who was a professor of sculpture at the Royal College of Arts in London. And his goal was to attempt to carve an Olmec head of his own using stone tools, just like they would have 3,000 years ago. Now, he attempted using several different kinds of rocks as his carving equipment. None of which were entirely successful due to the strength and hardness of the rock that he was attempting to carve. Now, back 3,000 years ago, they didn't have the metal tools and drills as we do nowadays, and so this was a lot more difficult than he expected. In the end, he discovered that the rock that he had selected likely would have been a lot more difficult to carve and had a higher hardness than the ones that the Olmec themselves would have used. And so he hypothesized that had he chosen a different rock, it might have been an easier process.
So now we'll be looking at a Mesoamerican beverage, pulque. Pulque is an alcoholic beverage produced through fermentation of sap from the meiji plant. In ancient Mesoamerica, pulque was allowed for certain groups or occasions like rituals or ceremonies. And the Aztecs viewed this drink as a highly desired item that showed nobility and importance. So to make pulque, the sap from the meiji plant was extracted and then fermented in a process close to the field. The pulque and the plant go bad very quickly, so consumption and fermentation has to be done in a matter of days. The fermentation of the sap actually starts in the plant as the naturally occurring microorganisms start to turn the sugars of the plant into alcohol as the plant grows. So once harvested, traditionally the sap was collected in dried gourds and then transferred into ceramic jars where further fermentation of the sap would take place. And to this day, it's done pretty much the same. When the fermentation process was complete, the pulque was typically consumed during a feast or a ritual, as well as an offering to the gods. This alcoholic beverage was also highly restricted, and its consumption was mainly for priests, warriors, occasionally the elderly, and women that were pregnant. There's a myth that states that a god was tricked into drinking pulque and getting drunk, and because of this, his drunkenness got him exiled from his land. So in Mesoamerican iconography now found in recent years, pulque is shown as a pot with a white foam coming out of it with a stirring straw. These drawings have been found in various murals and rock carvings, the most famous being a mural found in 1960 in a mural in the Cholula Pyramid of central Mexico. So this mural was 180 feet long and discovered in the pyramid. The mural depicted a feast with figures wearing elaborate outfits and drinking pulque while performing other ritual activities. Many scholars believe that this mural was the first sign of the pulque deities. Moving on, now we're going to look into the Aztec creation mythology a little bit more. That was lightly talked about above earlier in this presentation. Going back to the first 4 suns and prior to the first sun, 2 gods had 4 children: god of the seasons, god of earth, god of air, and god of war. These 4 children decided that they wanted a world and for people to live in it. But to create this world, it took several tries, which is the first 4 suns. So going into depth, the first attempt, the gods made fire, which was the sun, but it was not as strong, and it was only about half the size of the sun that we have now. They also made a man and a woman and told them what to do. The man was a farmer, and the woman spun thread. These 2 had many children who became the Masahulas, and they were the farmers that worked the land. So the gods, after creating these people, the gods then made time, which was 18 months spanning 360 days, which they considered a year. And once time and man and woman were created, an underworld was also created with two gods to rule this underworld. When all this was done, water was made with the addition of a giant fish, and the god looks at with a giant fish. The gods looked at all the things that they created, and they were not happy. The sun was not powerful enough, and they were unable to light and cause life to the world, causing one of the gods to turn into the sun, giving enough light to the world. A few years go by. One of his brothers, thinking that the current sun had reigned long enough, he struck the sun, causing him to fall into the water. This god came out of the water as a jaguar, eating all of the giants, ending the first sun. The fate of the other sons are depicted on this slide as well as earlier in the presentation. But as we get to the end of the fourth sun after the great flood, the gods looked at the world and decided that they were still not happy with it. The gods made peace with one another and rebuilt the world. But in this world, they went down and became great trees pushing up the sky, and it's considered that they still hold up the sky today. The gods then created new people to walk on the earth and a new sun, but for this new sun, they would have to be created. It need to be fed with human hearts and blood. After the sacrifice of a weak and a strong god, the suns were created, but the light was too intense on the world. So one of the gods and people down on the earth took a nearby rabbit and threw it in the flame, hitting one of the gods, causing its light to dim and become the moon instead of a sun. If you look at the moon today, there's a face of a rabbit, and that is considered where it came from.
This concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for listening.